It's early in the morning when the sound of his beeper awakens a Fall River detective. It's a body, he's told. A murder. What he doesn't know is that the crime scene he's about to see will strike fear into the hearts of all Americans. There are Satanists among us, people will hear from their TVs. No one is safe. The victim was named Doreen Ann Levesque. Abandoned from a young age, she had the worst kind of childhood and later found herself doing sex for work. She was brutally murdered on October 13, 1979. Her body was found under the bleachers at the Diamond Vocational High School. The two joggers that made the grisly discovery could hardly believe their eyes. She'd been tied up and viciously beaten, her face barely recognizable as the girl she'd been. Notably, to some, the murder had a ritual element to it. It wouldn't be long until people started to whisper the word Satanist, but as you'll see, people can get carried away, especially when they've grown up hearing dark tales about the devil. As city names go, Fall River sounds pretty, but to be frank, this wasn't a pretty place back then. Once a fairly prosperous textile town, Fall River in the late 70s and 80s had fallen on hard times. That was evident when you walked down some of the streets and witnessed the many drunks, the drug addicts, and prostitutes trying to eke out a living in some very harsh conditions. Levesque was one of the many young girls who'd ended up on the wrong part of town. On some nights, there were so many prostitutes and prospective Johns that it caused traffic jams. Still, while the place was run down somewhat, the murder shocked everyone, the sheer brutality of it. The next victim was 19-year-old Barbara Raposa. She was reported missing in November, but her body wasn't found until January 26, 1980. Like the first victim, she'd been bound and hit over the head and the face with a heavy object. Also, like the first victim, she'd been a victim herself of the travails of a difficult life. Like Levesque, she was known to frequent bars in some of the rougher parts of town, and she was said to have a drug habit. To make ends meet, she also got involved with sex work. So there were two young female victims. Both had been brutally killed after being tied up. These murders, it seemed, were not crimes of passion. The modus operandi in the killings pointed towards a possible serial killer. It also looked as though Levesque's body had been moved in a specific way, something that the police called posing. This sometimes happens in an attempt to hide something from police or because the act of posing gratifies the killer. But cops at the time were looking for perhaps something bigger than a lone serial killer. They had reason to believe Satanists were in their midst. They'd heard rumors about such people. On February 8, 1980, the same police were talking to a 20-year-old sex worker named Karen Marsden. It goes without saying that in a small city such as Fall River, if you worked on the streets, then you knew the other sex workers. Marsden was with cops that evening in a state of terror. She was rambling and at times making no sense, although she seemed to suggest that she knew something about the satanic rituals that had been going on, usually out in a place called Freetown State Forest. Police asked her who headed this murderous cult, but the only name she'd give them was Satan. She didn't actually mean Satan himself, but some evil person who'd been given the name Satan. She told cops that if she actually told them who this Satan person was, she'd be dead in no time. She refused to believe that the authorities could protect her. Marsden then told the police to drop her off at St. Mary's Church. She was so shaken up, she said she wanted to talk to a priest. The next day, she was reported missing by her grandmother. She wasn't seen again, alive at least. A couple of months later, her skull, with some teeth attached as well as clumps of her hair, was found in a nearby forest. Her body was nowhere to be seen. Now we'll introduce you to another important person in this story. She is Robin Marie Murphy, who was 17 when police started talking to her. Murphy was yet again another victim in the story, a girl who had suffered at the hands of men since she was just young. This trauma led her to a life of darkness, and at some point she ended up working as a pimp on the mean streets of Fall River. It's there that she got to know the murder victims. Like the other folks in the tale, she can often be found around the housing projects in the city called Harbor Terrace. On any given night there, you could score a gram of whatever, hear the screams and arguments of drunks, and watch the sex workers head toward their place of choice, Bedford Street. Strangely, the hub of criminal activity was just around the corner from police headquarters, but the cops didn't seem to interrupt the various transactions that took place there on a nightly basis. They did, however, often visit their informants. One of them became Murphy. Murphy, according to those who knew her back then, was a fearsome character. She might have been smaller in size than many of the male hoodlums, but she was said to have little fear of them. One of the males she might have had reason to fear was a pimp and a so-called competitor. His name was Carl Drew, and he was 26 years old when this was all going on. Now we have all but one of the main pieces in place. We can tell you how the cops began to solve the crimes. Well, how they thought they solved the crimes. You'll soon agree that they could have gotten many things wrong. So there were two pimps on the streets, one man and another a woman. Police believed that Drew ruled the streets for the most part. They said he was one mean man, and he led his territory by putting the fear of God in people. Well, we should say the fear of Satan, because cops believed that he was this Satan character. They often thought thought that Drew used satanic rituals to scare people. That body found under the bleachers was his work, and the reason he could get away with it was his control over people. The police believed that it was Drew who killed Marsden too, because she had known about his earlier murder. One story had it that Levesque was killed because she wouldn't work for Drew. It didn't help Drew's case, a man that couldn't read or write and had a hard-knock life himself, that Murphy said he was indeed Satan and the leader of the rituals. She also said that Marsden had told her that she'd been forced to watch Drew kill Levesque. Marsden and Murphy had certainly been close. It seems they become lovers at one point, and so if anyone knew Marsden's closest secrets, it would have been her. Murphy agreed to testify against Drew. She told detectives that he'd killed Marsden because of the threat she was going to talk to the cops. She said Drew often had satanic rituals out in the forest where he sacrificed animals on an altar in the name of Satan. Murphy said on the night that Marsden was killed, Drew had forced her to cut her throat, after which they decapitated Marsden and even played around with her head. This sounded utterly crazy, which among other things created what is called a satanic panic. All over the US at the time, there was talk about satanic ritual abuse. These so-called followers of Satan did terrible things to their victims to propitiate their devil leader. The very talk of such rituals sent shockwaves through the US. But let's remember, such talk also sold newspapers and had people glued to their TV screens. The witch hunts, you should recall, were also keenly followed a few hundred years earlier in Europe. There were 8 churches in Fall River, so talk about God and the devil and the destruction the latter wreaks on mankind was not out of the ordinary. Strange beliefs even today are held in what's called the US's Bible Belt, so buying into stories of satanic rituals was not too strange back in the 1980s. What's of importance here, though, is out of all the thousands of rumors of satanic ritualism happening, there's never been much proof they actually happened, if any proof at all. Much of the panic started because of a book called Michelle Remembers. The book featured a woman who, through hypnotism, could recall moments in her life which Satanists had ritually abused her. That book has now been widely discredited. A satanic cult murdering people in Fall River got a lot of airtime, and many people believed the stories, but besides the words of a few people, there was absolutely no evidence they happened. Still, the newspapers back then wrote that Drew was accused of threatening his girls with satanic violence if they ever got out of hand. Prosecutors explained to the court that Drew had told people that he was the son of Satan. The court heard that Murphy had been possessed by Drew when she committed those terribly violent acts. The prosecutor asked her, "And what did you do?" Murphy answered, "Cut her throat." She also said that Drew had cut off one of Marsden's fingers and taken a ring from it. Another young woman testified that one night Drew had given it to her in a bar. It didn't help his case that when Murphy was testifying, she wore a cross around her neck. The prosecution had done a good job at pitting the devil against a God-fearing victim. So when Murphy said Drew carved an X into the victim's body, the court almost shook with fear. When she said that Drew had spoken in an unknown language when doing the sacrifice, the palpable fear almost had people wanting to run out of the door. Murphy said he'd often speak in his foreign tongue when conducting other rituals that didn't involve murder. She said she'd attended around 10 of them from October 1979 to February 1980. The killing of Doreen Levesque was an offering of the soul of Satan, and so was the killing of Miss Marsden, she told the court. We should state something very important here. There was no physical evidence whatsoever that put Drew at any of those crime scenes. Nothing. Zilch. He was a man that couldn't read or write, that later said he thought the justice system could never send an innocent man to prison. And guess what? Murphy had been lying, and we mean telling very tall tales indeed. She later said that she'd been coerced by prosecutors into fingering Drew for the crime. As for the satanic stuff, she said she'd also been pushed to talk about that. She'd been told she'd get no more than 12 years for a second-degree murder conviction, which, as you'll see, didn't happen. She later said she did believe that Drew had committed the first murder. She didn't know it for a fact, but she was convinced enough to let him go down for the other murder. As we said, she was a victim herself. She'd suffered at the hands of a man named Andy Malte, someone who had committed heinous crimes against young women in the area. We won't go into details, but he was a pervert to the extreme, a wicked man if there ever was one. During the murder investigations, he'd been talking to cops, apparently trying to offer some help. Here was a man with a history of violence against young women, a man who was known to keep tools in his car to commit such violence, and he was trying to help the police. He told the police that he thought he knew what happened to the last victim, Miss Raposa. He said he'd had a vision in a dream in which he saw her being killed. Here is some of the transcript when he was interviewed by the police. Police, what was in his hand? A knife, a gun, Malte. Two hands in the air, something holding in between. Police, knife or a gun. Malte. From what I could see, it looked like a rock. Police later took him to the scene of the crime, and Malte knew exactly where the body had been found and which direction it had been pointed in. He even told the police, "I sense a murder weapon here. It might have been a piece of concrete." He was right about that. He knew too much. Police didn't think that Malte had some kind of psychic ability, and instead, they charged him with the murder. Murphy later testified in court again, this time saying she'd actually been with Malte at the time of the murder. Years later, she admitted to making that up too as retribution for the things he'd done to her. To recap, Murphy said she took part in one murder and then later said she totally lied about that. She'd also said she'd been with Malte on the night of another murder, but she'd lied about that too. At least one other victim would later come forward and say Malte had done horrible things to her, but she'd been ignored by local police when she made the complaint. We now have another man in prison serving time for the Marston murder. Drew was convicted of that and sentenced to life without parole. While police tried to say he killed her because she could talk about the Levesque murder, Drew was never convicted of that crime for lack of evidence. The connection was still used against him though. Not too long ago, some documentary filmmakers started investigating this dark tale. They looked into that ring that Drew had apparently given to the woman after taking it from Marston's hands. The woman told the documentary makers that there had been no ring, that she'd made that story up. The reason she said was cops threatened her with prison for another crime if she didn't testify to that story. If this couldn't get more confusing, another woman said she was there for the Marston murder, and she said it didn't take place in the forest. She said she saw Murphy committing the murder on a rooftop. The documentary maker said this in an interview: "You could literally just go into the Fall River Superior Court and read the trial transcripts, 11 volumes. No one that reads these trial transcripts will come away thinking Carl Drew was guilty, despite what the jury said. In fact, hardly anyone who has studied the case with new eyes thinks that Drew had anything to do with the murders. He might have been a violent and unethical man, a trafficker of vulnerable young women, but that doesn't mean he should be serving that long sentence if he's innocent of the murders. Some people think that it was Malte who was likely behind all the murders. He was certainly a sexual deviant, and the more you know about him, you could be convinced he was capable of serial killing. He died in prison many years ago, so no one can speak to him again. He once told the police, 'Once I worshipped Satan, but now I worship Jesus.' We doubt he ever really worshipped anyone. He was a ruthless criminal, and there is nothing especially occult about hurting young people. It seems beyond doubt that no crimes in Fall River back then took place because of any belief in Satan. There's enough evil in the story to fill a book, but no devil pulled the strings. There are a lot of victims, but it seems there's no overarching dark power involved except all the jagged pieces that fit into place to condemn some people to a life of misery. One of those victims could be Drew, who might well be the victim of the justice system. He later said, "I was thrown into the middle of a mass nightmare that involved macabre accusations of devil worship and human sacrifice, totally off-the-wall accusations that were right out of some thriller novel. None true as far as I was involved, and nothing like that was being said." As you watch this, the Massachusetts Innocence Program is still trying to get him a new trial, but since his appeals have been exhausted, it might mean some new evidence needs to come to light if he's ever to get out of prison. Murphy had been released on parole after her second-degree murder charge based on the lies she'd told, but she didn't adhere to the conditions of her parole and was sent back to prison. Now she'll have a new hearing. Now you need to watch arguably an even stranger murder story, brutal true story of what they didn't tell you about the Burger Chef massacre. Or have a look at this.